In the first session, we had some work to do in terms of definition, which is somewhat academic, but it's necessary, and I hope you appreciate that. You do a lot better job of communicating once you understand and communicate with people what you're talking about. I want to illustrate the concept of model comparison, which we introduced as really the basis for our evaluation of the two concepts, the two models. And we want to proceed looking at what Darwin saw, basis, looking at the models, creation versus evolution, in terms of the evidence that Darwin looked at. What was it that convinced him? Was there evidence that weighed heavily that caused him to conclude the scientific conclusion? What did he see? He traveled around the world on the Beagle, especially in the Galapagos Islands, and there saw some very strange and amazing animals, which can still be seen there today, that are not seen sometimes, some of them, in other parts of the world. And he reached some conclusions based on what he saw. He saw variation, and he saw certain finches, for example, on some islands that weren't on other islands, and he could see reasons for that. Some of the finches had little narrow beaks that were designed, I would say, for reaching into the bark and getting the insects out of the bark. Others had big, thick beaks, which were more effective for breaking the seeds that they would find on the ground. And sure enough, these islands that had very few trees, where they had to make a living eating the seeds off the ground, had the big beak birds, whereas those that were populated the birds with the thin, narrow beaks that could reach in the bark and get the insects. They had been selected by their environment, and he assumed that this then was proof of natural selection and concluded, therefore, proof of the general theory. Well, if you listen closely in the first session, I think you see some obvious problems here. Evidence for the special theory of evolution, which we know happens. You got brown rabbits down in Texas, and you got white rabbits up in the Arctic, and if you switch them around, before long you got exactly the same thing that you have now. The white ones will be selected as brown, and they just do better down in Texas if they're brown. They can hide in the grass. They do better in the Arctic if they're white. And that's not, I mean, they're white and brown to start with. They're white and brown to end with. And the same thing with the finches. The finches didn't become eagles. They didn't become anything but finches. But that was the proof. That's it. Does it even say anything about the general theory that all came from a common origin or changed from one kind to another kind? I think there is no evidence for general evolution, and yet that's what's presented in the textbooks as proof. I don't even think they're talking about the subject. Darwin didn't observe. He didn't see anything like this. He saw finches. And he saw nothing but finches. Now, if this were observed, then there would be a case, but we don't see that, do we? We see what we look at in the world around us, like with dogs, with cats, with cows. You see horizontal variation, but they continue to be cats, though there's a wide variety. They continue to be dogs, though there's a wide variety. They continue to be finches, though there's a wide variety. And what does that say? Well, I think the Creator put within each biotype the capacity to vary, to adapt to different circumstances, to enhance the survival value of each kind. But you see that you don't cross that barrier. One of the evidences that was presented soon after Darwin introduced his book involved the pepper moths in England. Before the Industrial Revolution, the trees were light-colored, and the pepper moths, which were both light and dark, showed up like this, with the light-colored ones somewhat camouflaged. The dark ones are standing out, and so we were told, all right, Mr. Bird flies around looking for supper, and which one's going to get it? You know, the dark one is the one that's in trouble, isn't it? That sounds reasonable. It's not as reasonable as it sounds, but that's That was the story that was told. After the Industrial Revolution, we see soot covering the trees, and now then the dark ones are camouflaged and the light ones stick out. And we did see a relative shift in the numbers of the populations. There were more of the light ones to start with. There were more of the dark ones after the Industrial Revolution. That shift in population changed. The assumption was it was because of the soot on the trees. That's not the reason. In fact, we're not sure what the reason is. But the main point is that there were light ones and dark ones afterwards. And so do we have proof of everything coming from a common origin? It doesn't even relate to the subject, does it? St. Matthews was chosen to write the foreword to the centennial edition of Origin of the Species. This was a great honor as a biologist. And in that introduction, referring to the pepper moths, he says the experiments beautifully demonstrate natural selection. And I think he would modify that now with the last few years' investigation. But they beautifully, he says, demonstrate natural selection or survival of the fittest in action, but they do not show evolution in progress. For however the population may alter, all the moths remain from beginning to end Bistion betulara. Same species. And yet every school child in here has been taught this as proof of evolution from Darwin's time. But there's no evolution there. They're light and dark to start with, light and dark to end with, and it's gotten worse. This statement it was made in the International Wildlife Encyclopedia several years ago, referring to Biston betulara, this light and dark pepper moth. This is the most striking evolutionary change ever witnessed by man. I think they're right. I think that's the best that they can come up with, which is encouraging. But it says nothing about general evolution. The special theory is the best, and it's not even a real good example of that. Jerry Cohn published in Nature back in 1998 and several articles since then a critique of these experiments with the pepper moths. And he says the most serious problem is that in Biston betulara, it does not rest on tree trunks. You can't find them on tree trunks. And of course, the whole theory was they are camouflaged on the tree trunks. Exactly 2 moths have been seen in such a position, more than 40 years of intensive research. The natural resting spots are, in fact, a mystery. And of course, you read that in your textbook, didn't you? This alone invalidates Kidwell's release recapture experiments, as moths were released by placing them directly onto tree trunks, that is, gluing them, where they were highly visible to bird predators. That's far from a natural experiment. Finally, the results of Kidwell's behavioral experiments were not replicated in later studies. Moths have no tendency to choose matching backgrounds. And so we've learned it's not even a good example of horizontal variation. It's just lousy science, but it just so beautifully illustrated natural selection that everybody just pounced on it and put it in all the textbooks. Nobody repeated the experiment. Nobody checked until recently. Peppered moths illustrate horizontal variation at best, but really nothing new and certainly nothing about the general theory of evolution. Now, this is not what Darwin saw, but let me throw this in here because it's a similar argument. We see variation with bacteria, pathological bacteria, the stuff that makes us sick. And we're told that this development of antibiotic resistance in bacteria is a good example of evolution. And the facts here are misrepresented, and I think to the detriment of medical science. This is not an evolved process. Notice the statement in the Medical Tribune, and this was several years ago, and though more has been learned since then. In this article about what was found up in the Arctic, it says it may be time to rethink our thoughts about the mechanisms for antibiotic resistance patterns. Bacteria from the bowels of 3 members of an 1845 Arctic expedition have survived 140 years and are showing resistance to patterns to modern antibiotics. Now, here are these Arctic explorers, they got frozen, 1845, long before antibiotics. And they still have bacteria in their bowels, so they find them, they dig them up, they see what kind of bacteria they have. Current theory suggests that antibiotic resistance is linked to long-term exposure to antibiotics. If you don't have too many antibiotics, that'll cause you to evolve this. Well, here they were there long before antibiotics. Needless to say, antibiotics were not developed till long after these 19th century bacteria and their host had been buried in the Arctic permafrost. And so it's time to rethink this. What happened is that these various forms existed all along. The antibiotic resistant form was recessive. There weren't that many of them. The normal form dominated, but you kill off the normal form with antibiotics, guess what happens? The recessive form takes over. Nothing's evolved. You've just lost part of the information in the normal form. In Nature, 1999, we read, "Our results show that resistance to antibiotics is widespread, at least in some wild populations, even though they've never, to our knowledge, been exposed to antibiotics." In other words, it exists already. It doesn't come about as a result of evolution. It's there, but you kill off the normal form and they take over. Darwin observed small changes, like the small changes in antibiotics. And by the way, just as an aside, if the doctors don't understand what's happening here, if they have this evolutionary propaganda that's skewed their thinking, how effective are they going to be in dealing with this problem? I think there are some very severe consequences to the lousy science that's going on. Like the slaughter or the mutilation of a generation that occurred as a result of evolutionary theory, when people had their appendix taken out and their tonsils taken out, having been taught these were vestiges of an evolutionary history. We found out that they're necessary, they're a part of the immune system, and removing them has perhaps been the cause of the allergy upheaval, or the just tremendous amount of allergies that are caused when we remove part of the immune system. This is one of the results. Well, in fact, there was a law in Wisconsin that said when you open up an abdomen, you have to remove the appendix anytime you open it up. That was repealed not more than 10 years ago. Why? Well, you don't need it. It's a vestige of evolutionary history. Hogwash is our Texas term for that. It's not so, and it caused the butchering of a generation. A little off subject. Let's get back to what Darwin saw. Darwin observed small changes, as we observe today in our work. Darwin changes would add up to the big changes. He didn't see that. He just made that assumption. Now, that's not the way science proceeds, and that's not the way it's reported in the textbooks. He saw proof, is what they say. No, he saw small changes, assuming that they add up to the big changes. Well, is it possible that the small changes add up to the big changes? Well, when we can test it, we find that assumption is falsified. No, they do not add up when you can test. You can assume it as long as you don't test. But there are places and areas where we can test, where millions of generations can be observed. I say, no, you can't test it because it takes too long. Well, what about with fruit flies? You've got a new generation every 2 weeks in some instances. And when you do that every 2 weeks and you're multiplying, we've been doing this to fruit flies since the early 1900s in college classes. Terrible things to these poor little things, fruit flies. They put mutagenic chemicals in there and they radiate them, and they cause curly wings and sepia-eyed and no-eyed, and just have all kinds of mutations. And guess what we have produced? We got the same thing we had to start with. We've got fruit flies. Some of them are kind of weird looking, but then they die out. And we've got the same thing. And there have been literally billions of generations observed. Notice, and of course the same thing with bacteria, as we'll point out, but they're still the same kind. Michael DeSalle is writing in the Encyclopedia of Life Sciences, talking about these fruit flies. He says, if mutations were a variation of value to the species, then evolution of Drosophila, the fruit fly, should have proceeded with extreme rapidity. Because Drosophila, they really mutate. They've got one of the highest mutation rates of anything. And so if this is going to help, then boy, you really ought to have had some evolution here. Yet the facts entirely contradict the validity of this theoretical deduction, for we have seen that the Drosophila type has been known since the beginning of the Tertiary period, that is, for about 50 million years. I don't buy his dates, but let's play the game their way and see how it comes out. It has not been modified in any way during that time, and yet there have been literally billions of generations observed in the college classrooms. It doesn't add up. The changes don't add up to when you can observe all the generations that should have added it up. What about bacteria? They reproduce sometimes every 20 minutes. Now, you really ought to be able to observe some change adding up here. Warner Braun, in his book Bacterial Genetics, says, despite the rapid rate of propagation, the enormous size of attainable populations within initially homogeneous bacterial populations apparently do not progress beyond certain boundaries. Now, we observe variation, but that's not all we observe. Just as dramatically and just as obviously and dependably, we observe boundaries to that variation, but that's not what they talk about because it doesn't tell the story they want to tell. We see that with the fruit fly. When we can have billions of generations that are observed, we see variation, but we see boundaries. There are two observations. They can explain one, we can explain both. Bacteria, here are fossil bacteria supposed to be billions of years old, look just like today's, except they were a little larger back then. Reporting here in Science News, what intrigues William Schropp, paleontologist, University of California at LA, is a lack of change. Now, the red-colored one is the fossil bacteria. Just like it is the modern bacteria below it. 1 billion-year-old fossils of blue-green bacteria. Well, I don't think it's anywhere near that old, obviously, but play the game their way. Let's say these are 1 billion years old. What's the problem? New generation for 1 billion years, and they hadn't changed. This is not quite what they predict, is it? They surprisingly look not like modern families, modern genera. They look exactly like modern species, and they're supposed to be 1 billion years old. When we look at organisms that we can test, where we can test, we sidestep this time objection, you can't observe because it takes so much time, by organisms that reproduce rapidly, and we see millions of billions of generations, we see barriers very dramatically demonstrated. Yes, we observe variation. I would say they're horizontal variations. The more we examine those, I think we see they don't fit their view. They're all harmful or neutral in a normal environment. A few are useful in limited environments. All degrade the complexity. They lose information. Some are cyclic. They change this way and then they change back with the environment. And these are not the kind of changes that they need to produce the onward and upward process of evolution anyway. But we see that. We also, and by the way, none are cumulative and able to produce new organisms. But in addition, we see boundaries. Now, as we compare the two models on the basis of how well they can explain evolution, creation, how well do they explain what we observe? Well, both evolution and creation can explain variation. We would predict the variability with limits to be able to survive in varying circumstances. They would predict variation. They, of course, predict in that prediction. We would predict that they are reproducing according to kind and don't transgress that kind. We explain both of them. They explain one of them, not very well. I think there's an obvious superior position with the creation explanation. This is beginning to be acknowledged. As far back as 1980, there was a very important conference that took place in Chicago to consider this problem, the fact that when we can test this, they don't add up. Reporting in Science, we read a historic conference. The central question of the Chicago conference was whether mechanisms underlying micro, this was the term there, little bitty evolution, can be extrapolated or extended forward to explain the phenomenon of macro, big evolution. Do the little ones add up to the big ones, is another way of saying that. Can that happen? That's what the conference was about. The answer can be given as a clear no. And these were 300 of the leading authorities in the field. One of them was Francisco Ayala, again reporting in Science. Major figure in propounding the modern synthesis. That's Darwin's theory today, synthesizing Mendelian genetics with Darwinian natural selection. That's now the modern view. He's the major figure in propounding that. He says small changes do not accumulate. Well, what's the mechanism for evolution taught in every biology textbook in the country? Mutations add up to big changes. Doesn't happen. The leading authorities in the world historically documented that. Here's S.M. Stanley of Johns Hopkins University. Natural selection, long viewed as the process guiding evolutionary change, cannot play a significant role in determining the overall course of evolution. Macroevolution is decoupled from micro. The little ones don't add up to the big ones. And so if these little ones don't add up, what's natural selection got to do with it? It's supposed to select these small changes that are not, it has nothing to do with it because they don't add up. And so the idea that mutations are a benefit by those who are knowledgeable, though it's still in the textbooks. As Gould himself acknowledges, he says, I've been watching it slowly unravel as a universal description of evolution. I've been reluctant to admit it, since beguiling is often forever, but that theory, he's talking about what's taught in the textbooks, as a general proposition is effectively dead, despite its persistence as textbook orthodoxy. Now here is the leading authority, the leading spokesman for evolution in the United States. What's taught in the textbooks has been dead since 1980. That was acknowledged it. Now here are two models that are being weighed here. In other words, here's a horse race with two horses, and one of them drops dead. Which one do you think is going to win? That's not much of a horse race, is it? Now, Gould thinks punctuated equilibrium can save the day, and we'll talk about that when we look at the fossil record Tuesday evening. But this is what's in the textbooks, and the leading authorities say it doesn't work. It's dead. Which means best? I think creation explains both observations, the variation plus the boundaries, whereas evolution explains half of the observations not very well. Variation, it doesn't explain, that is, it can explain, but that's all it can explain. It can't explain the boundaries. When you do the model comparison, I think the advantage is obvious. Let's go back to the start of this horse race. The most critical part in the origin of life. We've looked at what Darwin saw. Let's go back to the beginning, to the origin. And we are all interested in how life originated, and all the textbooks want to talk about this and refer to the Miller-Urey experiment as producing life in the test tube. And this is the apparatus that was used. We've got hydrogen, methane, ammonia, water vapor circulated through this apparatus, subjected to a spark, and it's supposed to produce amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. I had a friend of mine who was taking biology at the University of Chicago, and they had one of these fancy auditoriums, the circular slanted floor leading down to the floor, a very dramatic position for the lecturer to stand, and he had this apparatus set up, and everybody's wondering where the professor was. It was time to start, and then the lights began to dim, and he jumped out from the side with a black cape around him like Superman. The lights flashed on, and he says, "We've just produced life in the test tube." And that's the kind of claim that's being made in the universities. Well, what's going on here? In the first place, the result is, but amino acids are basically the building blocks, by no means life. One of the major objections is that this is impossible with oxygen, which they readily acknowledge, and so they assume that there was no oxygen in the early environment. To a geologist, you just have to smirk. Accepting their dating processes, the oldest rocks, sedimentary rocks on the American continent, are up on the Canadian Shield, the red beds, and they're red. Why? Because of rust. FeO, what? Three oxygens. There's all kinds of oxygen in the oldest rocks. Well, they can't have any life already. The oxidizing environment will stop this, and so they assume it's just contrary to all the evidence. And besides that, even worse, what happens when you don't have the ozone? You have all kinds of radiation that would kill anything that starts down here, this primitive life anyway. Well, ozone is a form of oxygen, an isotope, and if you have ozone, you got oxygen. All kinds of problems with the idea. But it's impossible with oxygen. Without oxygen, which would mean without ozone, which would mean it would be killed by the radiation. But they say, all right, we're going to use hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and water vapor because that's what gives them the results, in spite of the evidence for the atmosphere. They also leave out the fact that this spark destroys a whole lot more than it synthesizes. And so once it's formed, any small part is formed, they quickly trap it out, as we see down at the bottom, artificially, to prevent it going back through, because the next time around it'd be destroyed. So they form a little bit, trap it out immediately. The result of this artificial process, which would never happen naturally and in the presence of oxygen, is amino acids. Now, amino acids by themselves are certainly not alive. But you find a random assortment of hundreds of kinds produced. Only 20 approximately are used in life processes, and all of them are left-handed. If you know about biology, you got right-handed and left-handed, they fit together. Life forms use left-handed ones. Well, what this produces is not the 20 that you need, but hundreds of them all together with the right and left hand. Somehow they got segregated so that they're just the 20 and they're all left-handed, which is going to happen never in nature. And certainly that's not life. And people are beginning to see through the problem here. Reported in Time several years ago, this textbook picture of how life originated, so familiar to college students just a generation ago, was under serious attack. You have to see the hypocrisy in that statement. Familiar to college students just a generation ago. Look in the textbook today. It's in every biology textbook in the country. But he says it is under serious attack. New insights into planetary formation have made it increasingly doubtful that clouds of methane and ammonia dominated the atmosphere of the primitive. Yes, we know that never happened. And so, yeah, that's a problem. When we look at the simple cell, in big quotes here, what we've learned in the last 10 years is just absolutely mind-boggling. And that's an understatement. It's not just a few little bricks, and the amino acid would be analogous to a brick for this building. Okay, you got a brick? Fine, good for you. What about the electrical system, and what about the seats and the plumbing and the superstructure that holds it up? You don't have a building just because you got a brick, and that's a very weak analogy at that. When we look at the simple cell, notice the statement by Monod, who is a Nobel laureate, microbiologist. He says, we have no idea what the structure of a primitive cell might have been. The simplest living system known to us, the bacterial cell, employs the same genetic code, the same mechanism of translation as do human cells. There ain't no such thing as this simple cell. You've got billions of bits of information in many of them. The simplest cells available to us have nothing primitive about them. Bill Gates comments on this when he says, human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. Now that's cells with the nucleus, with the DNA, but that's typical of what you find in the world, and it's just more complex than any software, which of course just happens naturally all by itself, doesn't it? No, we've got more than that. Carl Sagan is talking about the information content of the cell, and he's understating the case. But he says the information content of a simple cell has been estimated around 10 to the 12th bits comparable to about 100 million pages in the Encyclopedia Britannica. That's the simplest cell we know anything about. Now, you're walking along the beach and you see 100 million pages in Encyclopedia Britannica. And you think, boy, the wind must have really been blowing last night. Lots of waves. You see John loves Mary, and you know that didn't happen naturally. But 100 million pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica, what must you conclude? Where did this come from? The answer you heard to that question is exactly what you hear on the college campuses when you ask that question. They have no answer to where that information came from. Now, when they look up in the sky, the SETI program is supposed to be looking for intelligent design, intelligent signals from outer space. What are they looking for? Little dot, dot, dash, dash. Just simple, ordered sequence. What if they saw 100 million pages in the Encyclopedia Britannica? Would that indicate intelligence? Well, when they look down their telescope or their microscope, they don't see intelligence. When they look up the telescope, and if they saw a few dots and dashes, they'd see intelligence. They look down their microscope, they see 100 million pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and they don't see any intelligence. Can you grasp that? Does that make any sense at all? I think we're seeing obvious evidence of intelligence. And it's just overwhelming. Tom Siegfried, who is an atheist, science editor of the Dallas Morning News, said, "Standard science in search of the recipe for life has, for the most part, only deepened the mystery." And he's an anti-creationist and a devout atheist. But he says even the simplest biological systems are carrying out hundreds and thousands of chemical reactions simultaneously, keeping them all organized, says Leslie Orgel of the Salk Institute. They're trying to find the origin of life. Hundreds of thousands of reactions, all at the same time, all perfectly organized, all coordinated in every cell in your body. Trillions of them. He uses an analogy like this: an information storage system. That's the DNA. That records these 100 million pages in Encyclopedia Britannica in the simplest cell. You've got to have an information reading system for that to be worth anything. You've got to have an energy system for it to work. You've got to duplicate that and then carry it out to the proteins that then follow the instructions to manufacture. You've got to have a membrane system to hold it all together, to let certain things in and let certain things out, the semi-permeable membrane that's very selective in what it lets in and lets out. What happens if you have all of that but don't have the membrane? Dead. Doesn't go anywhere. What if you have all of this but don't have the energy system? Or all of this but don't have the duplication? You've got to have all of this at the same time or you've got nothing. Where did it get started? Well, you can't go step at a time. It doesn't work. Michael Behe has illustrated this with a simple mousetrap, what he calls irreducible complexity. Complexity is a problem, but it's worse. It's irreducible complexity. You want to build a mousetrap, and so you get this platform without the holding bar and without the spring and without the hammer. You catch a few mice, and then you add the spring. Is that going to work? No. If you don't have the spring, you're not going to catch. If you don't have the hammer, you've got to have all of those parts, or it's worthless, isn't it? You can't build up step by step, and that's very, very simple compared to the hundreds of thousands of chemical reactions that are all coordinated in the simplest cell, and this 100 million pages that are guiding the process. You can't add up step by step. Interestingly, in Origin of the Species, he says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Crash. There it goes. What we have learned in microbiology in the last 10 years has absolutely demolished, based on the criteria of Darwin. He says this is a test. It would demolish his theory. Actually, the theory of evolution and its acceptance was based on very limited scientific knowledge of the 19th century. It has been decisively defeated by developments in microbiology, in anatomy, in biochemistry, in paleontology, and we see that the more we learn. And it's time to say so. And it's time to let our students know that. I think it has absolutely with this statement by Francis Crick. He's the Nobel laureate who helped define DNA, won the Nobel Prize for it. Now, he's an atheist. But he says an honest man, that's what we talked about this morning, is honestly looking at the evidence. An honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. Now, he's hedging every way he can. But an honest man has to say this. So many of the conditions which would had to have been satisfied to get it going. That's what it looks like. Well, just be honest enough to say, well, that must have been what happened. Natural processes can't explain what we see. Natural processes do not produce 100 million pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica. That information doesn't generate itself. Information goes downhill, not up. And so it had to come from somewhere. And it didn't come by itself. Well, Crick says it must have come from outer space. That's his explanation, scientific explanation. Transpermia, which is not really even talking about origins. That's in logic what we know as an infinite regression. He says, he's not really talking about origin, he's talking about directions. It came from over there. Okay, where did that come from? Well, it came from over here. And where did that come from? That came from over here. You're not talking about starting anything. You're just talking about it came from somewhere else. You're not even talking about origins. And yet that's supposed to be the scientific explanation. There is no way to explain what we know today naturalistically. It just won't work. And the leading authorities tell us that. It's dead. In terms of the horse race, we get back to the start of the race, the two gates swing open, and one of the horses drop dead. Can't even get out of the gate. And so I think I know which one wins. When we evaluate a person, we see one model explains both variation and boundaries. The other explains only variation, not very well. And then the explanation of the origin of life is just dead. Which one's the better model? Scientifically. Is that a hard question? I don't think it is at all. One can explain the source of information. We have a source. They don't have a clue. I ask the question all over the country. Where did the information come from? And I just sit there and listen to the silence and enjoy it because they have no answer. All right, I hope that's obvious and helpful to you. Let's see if some of you may have some questions. Yes.
Is methane an organic compound, and where does it come from?
Yes and no. It can come from organic processes. It can come from non-organic processes. It really is not definitive when you find methane. You find methane on Mars, outer space. You find it in a lot of places. A lot of it on Mars. Some have said, well, we must have some life forms up there. We got a lot of methane. Well, it could have been, could not have been, and that's the objection even by the atheists. They say, well, it can be produced just as easily by non-organic processes. Now, it doesn't tell us anything. Other questions? Yes.
On this? Hold on just a second. Okay, go ahead.
These credible people that you've talked about that are really the source of the theory of evolution and that, and they're saying that, well, we missed it, where it's dead, the theory is dead. I can't believe that they would just accept the other side. So what are they doing to keep this thing going, per se, so they don't lose credibility?
They will tell you that mutations are not going to produce anything new. Gould, and each one has a different view because there's nothing that's viable that they can test or show. Gould's imagination before he died was that these small changes certainly don't add up, and so there must be some kind of change in the embryo that would, when you change it at that stage, it would produce big results. And so some kind of embryonic accident changed ape to man, and that it happened quickly, so quickly that it wasn't recorded in the fossil record. It sounds like a miracle to me. And he will emphasize, no, this is not miraculous. We'll talk about that Tuesday night. His punctuated equilibrium is a patch over this hole that he acknowledges is there. I think it's worse than the hole, but we'll look at that. They really don't have good answers. They have great faith. They know it happened, and their response often is, well, yes, we don't know how it happened. We can't explain it, but we know it happened. Why? Because they're not even going to consider a divine explanation. That's unscientific. The only thing they're allowed to look at is in that they have this a priori determination to be naturalistic. That's their religion. And so it has to be evolution. That's right. If it's only naturalistic, they're right. And they have made that commitment, and so that's all they'll look at. So the fact they can't explain how it worked doesn't bother them all that much. They'll find it one day. But that's how they're thinking. But it's fundamentally, at its base, a religious conviction. And based on blind faith, not a very good faith. Other questions?
Last night, Don, you'd made the statement that many of our teachers, I think you were talking about the universities, although they don't accept the theory and they perhaps believe in creation, they have a reluctance to do that because of their job. And I'm wondering about the teachers in general. Are a lot of them in that same situation?
It's difficult to generalize because there are obvious exceptions. Most teachers in high school, a lot of them in college, simply teach what they've been taught. That's all they know. They haven't seen an alternative. They don't know, and so that's what. It's not this conspiracy to overwhelm. It's just they don't. That's all they know, and so that's. But the ones that we've been quoting, the leaders in the field, they know. And yes, we do run into this on the college campuses. College professors that do know, and they have seen and see exactly what I've been telling you. And there have been more and more of, we showed the 350, the 100, then 350 scientists. Michael Behe that we referred to with his mousetrap is head of the department of, well, a professor of biology at Lehigh University and a very respected scientist. And he says he's not a creationist. He sure sounds like one, but he says you can't do this naturally. It just, I'm sorry, I don't have an alternative, but you can't do it this way. He's a tenured teacher. They can't fire him, and so he can say that. But most professors aren't. And I made the comment that when I'm lecturing on campus, it's typical to have maybe a half a dozen professors come up to me. This happened at A&M, probably more, where there was just vicious opposition and cussing and screaming and hollering from the professors. At least a half a dozen, or probably more, came up and said, well, I agree with what you're saying. I just can't admit it or I'd be fired. But keep up the good work. And then they hunker down and walk out. And it's, they want to feed their kids. They don't want to get fired, and they have a career. They've invested all of this time and have their degrees, and they'd lose it all. And it's true. I mean, they're absolutely right. I've seen professor after professor fired when he made that commitment. Some of you may know Bert Thompson, who is a brother, who was professor of microbiology at Texas A&M. When it became known that he was a creationist, he was fired. Had a good friend at University of New Orleans, a physical chemist, whom we convinced based on the geological evidence that we'll be talking about tomorrow evening. Yes. That creation was the best explanation, and just became very militant. He was a tenured professor at the University of New Orleans, His resume, you know, we had him speak for us a time or two, and he'd had this resume of about 6 pages. I said, "You've got to get this down." He was on the peer review panel of 12 major technical journals, grant request appraisal committee of 6 major institutions, including the Atomic Energy Commission. I mean, this is a really high-powered scientist. And he made the bad judgment of debating the head of his department on public TV there in New Orleans, and just absolutely embarrassed her to death. And within a month, they had trumped up sexual harassment charges against him and forced him into early retirement. And he's really having a hard time at this point making a living because nobody will touch him. Tremendous scientist. This is a real threat. Now, there are others who, like the 300 that we quoted, that have the stature and enough clout that they don't have to worry about that. And they're helping all the others. That's making a lot of progress. And some with a great deal of respect are exerting their influence. Dr. Carroll, who is head of the National Genome Project, is an outspoken creationist. Now, the sequencing of the human genome is one of the greatest accomplishments of our age, scientifically. The head of that project is an outspoken creationist. And so people are having a harder time saying, well, if you're a creationist, you're a nut. You know, that's not working too well anymore. Damadian, who invented the MRI machine, again, one of the major accomplishments, scientific accomplishments of our age, is a very militant, outspoken young earth creationist. So we see lots of progress being made, but there's still very serious problems. Other questions? Thank you very much for your interest. We're going to be talking about the age of the earth in just a little while. I think that's one of the most critical issues, and I think we'll be looking at some exciting evidence, one of the more exciting lectures, I think. So we hope to see you then.